Hello everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today I want to talk about what's going on in Syria. It's been a couple of weeks now since the latest alleged chemical attack took place in Douma, Syria, and I've personally not done any reports yet on this. I did one article briefly kind of touching on the matter, but not focused on it specifically, because in my experience, when these things happen, journalists, YouTubers, everybody's in a rush to be the first one to report on something and to be the first one to yell false flag and you know, all these kind of things. And I think it's important, especially if you care about credibility or truth at all, to take some time to remain quiet and sit back and let things develop and see how they unfold. And so it's been a couple of weeks now, and I've done just that, and I've just spent all of today researching and seeing all the different viewpoints from the mainstream news wires to the MSNBC and the independent media, CNN, the US government, the Russian government, the Syrian government, journalists on the ground, apparent witness reports, and all of these things. Everything that's available, I've looked at it. I think I could say pretty conclusively I've touched on most of the issues related to what's going on in Syria. This video is not going to go into the deep history of what's been going on in Syria and the history of Western involvement and attempts to get involved in Syria and Iran. I will briefly touch on that towards the end because I think it's important for the historical context. But that is not what this video is about. So I am very aware that the problems in Syria, the things we're about to talk about, and I hope you are aware that these did not just start in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years. They did not kick off with the Arab Spring and turn into this random protests and resistance to Bashar al-Assad, which is what we're often told. These problems have been going on for quite some time, much longer than just the past few years, and it's important to remember that. But I want to talk about just a few different points that I think are important to really understand what's going on in Syria. And just as a quick recap for those who might be coming in totally new to this, there has been an apparent rebel resistance against President Bashar al-Assad in Syria since the 2011 Arab Spring happened in Tunisia and in Egypt and spread elsewhere, supposedly, to places like Libya. So since that time, there have been these rebels, these moderate rebels that the U.S. has been funding, and this is open fact, there's no conspiracy theory about this. But what is lesser known, and now is starting to become more known, at least for those who are not totally glued into the mainstream only, is the fact that the U.S. government funded these rebels, which were actually not moderates, that they were linked to Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, and the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, ISIS, these terror groups. The U.S. was funding and partnering with some of them in order to create resistance and using them as a proxy to create trouble within Syria, in the hopes of pushing this idea that there is this legitimate rebellion and thus the people of the world need to unite together to come overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. I will also say this in case you're listening and you're getting ready to type some angry comment calling me a stooge for Russia or an apologist for Bashar al-Assad, because as we're going to show you, that's kind of becoming a theme now. Just as people said before, you must love Saddam Hussein if you don't support the war in Iraq. You must think Gaddafi is a hero and all these things. No, that's not what I think. I think these guys are all tyrants. They're all rulers who want to rule over free people. But at the end of the day, the U.S. government and Western governments have their own reasons for wanting to go into there. So let's look at a few of these points related to it and hopefully provide some clarity, if not provide more questions, because there are definitely more questions than answers when it comes to this situation. So back in February 2nd, 2018, just a couple months ago, we had these reports discussing the fact that there is no evidence, that there really is no hard evidence that Bashar al-Assad was responsible for the 2013 and 2017 attacks. Now, there's conflicting reports, and we're going to go into that. So if you're hearing me saying there's no evidence and you're ready to turn off the video, please just continue to listen. So in February 2018, the Associated Press reports that Defense Secretary, the head of the Department of Defense, Jim Mattis, said that the U.S. has no evidence to confirm reports from aid groups and others that the Syrian government has used the deadly chemical sarin on its citizens. He says, we have other reports from the battlefield, people who claim it's been used. We do not have evidence of it. And he says, we're looking for it because clearly we're dealing with the Assad regime, which has used denial and deceit to hide their outlaw actions. So right there, saying that there's no evidence. That's as far back as February, right? And in addition to that, we have a Newsweek article, an op-ed written by Ian Wilkie, who's a veteran intelligence contractor, former intelligence contractor, and a lawyer, who's describing the situation as well. And he talks about the same thing, how Mattis has come out and said that there is no evidence, and that this, in fact, as he puts it, flies in the face of the White House memorandum. So the White House put out a memo a couple months back saying that they had clear evidence that the attacks in 2013 in Ghouta, the 2017 attacks in Khan Shaykhur, and now these new attacks hadn't quite happened yet, but they had evidence that these attacks were done by the Syrian government. And they declassified that, they released it to the public in order to get public support for their bombing using a Tomahawk missile against the Shirat air base in Syria last year. So basically the 2017 attack, chemical attack, supposed attack in Khan Shaykhur, they say it was launched out of this missile, out of this air base in Shirat. And so the U.S. government says, here's this memo, this is what we have, this proves that they did it, so this is why we're going to bomb them. Yet the head of the military, the boss of the military, you could say, is saying that there is no evidence for this. And this is, just months ago. Wilkie goes on to say that Mattis offered no temporal qualification, which means that both the 2017 event in Khan Shaykhur and the 2013 tragedy in Ghouta are unsolved cases in the eyes of the Defense Department and Defense Intelligence Agency. So, again, unless they're not releasing all the information they had, which you think they would if they were trying to convince the world that this really happened. So, as this author says, there are casualties from organophosphate poisoning in both cases. That much is certain. And I'm not even 100% sure that is certain, but we'll give him that for the moment. But America has accused Assad of direct responsibility for the Syrian attacks and even blamed Russia for culpability in this. So they're blaming Russia's involvement. They're talking about they have, the U.S. is saying that they have clear evidence that these attacks happened, and they're calling for using military. This is what people should really just pause for a moment and reflect on, that these individuals are not just talking about, some sort of trite choices. They're talking about launching missiles when they don't have evidence. This attack, this most recent attack, which happened now 2 weeks ago here in April 2018 in Duma, supposedly, it's been 2 weeks now, but the U.S., and there's still no conclusive evidence. We're waiting for weapons investigators to go in there, chemical weapons investigators to go in there and show us what happened or what they find. But the U.S. has already launched missiles. Trump has already, of course, launched another attack. So the writer here says that serious, experienced chemical weapons experts and investigators such as Hans Blick, Scott Ritter, Gareth Porter, and Theodore Postal have all cast doubt on the official American narratives regarding President Assad employing sarin gas. And now, speaking of Theodore Postal, I wrote this article last year about a former Defense Department science advisor. Theodore Postal debunks claims of Syrian chemical attacks. And you can read this. All these links are going to be posted below in the show notes. But on April 4th of last year, residents of the town of Khan Shaykhur suffered a chemical gas attack that reportedly killed 74 people and injured 557. Those numbers may have changed. And the U.S., without any clear evidence, immediately pointed the finger at Bashar al-Assad. And this was one of the reasons that there was a bombing last year. Now, those claims have been disputed by Theodore Postal, who is a professor emeritus at MIT. He's also a former scientist with the U.S. Department of Defense, and he put out a 14-page report debunking the White House's report that concluded that Assad was behind the attacks. 14-page report available for the public to see. He found that the U.S. and supporting governments have not provided any concrete evidence to back up their claims. He also said that it's likely that the attack was carried out by the rebel forces. The rebel forces are the same groups we were talking about a moment ago. The U.S.-funded, Western-funded, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra Front, ISIS, these non-moderate rebels, these people who are out there doing atrocious things, who are being used as a proxy by the Western interest to try to overthrow Assad. So Postal goes ahead and debunks that report from the White House. He says, quote, the International Business Times says the implication of Postal's analysis is that it was carried out by anti-government insurgents, as Khan Shaykhur is a militant controlled territory of Syria. So where the attack happened was controlled by the rebels, and the rebels are likely responsible. And we're talking about the 2017 attack. So that's one of these experts saying that, hey, there are some doubts in there. And in the 2013 attack, a similar thing. The 2013 Ghouta attack employed homemade rockets, which are usually used by these rebels, the quote-unquote insurgents or terrorists, whatever you want to call them. And the other thing is the White House memo from last year that they released to justify the attack on the military base after the apparent gas attack in Khan Shaykhun, they relied heavily on the Syrian white helmets who were filmed at the scene having contact with supposed sarin-laden bodies, and they did not suffer any ill effects. So now one thing about this is a lot of the conflict in Syria has relied on the white helmets, and I think it's problematic. So if you look at this, I'm just going to show you these pages really quickly. These reports from James Corbett on his website, thecorbettreport.com. Just search white helmets, and you can see one that he did just a month ago called "The White Helmets Are a Propaganda Construct," which is definitely worth your time. And this is if you're really after the truth. You can dismiss this and say, oh, this is propaganda, this is conspiracy theory, whatever, Russian, yada, yada, yada. That means you're not ready for the truth. If you really want to go after that, just watch this report. And if it doesn't convince you, fine, debunk it, show that it's false. James also interviews Vanessa Beeley, who exposes the white helmet. So this, I would look further into this. And then Vanessa Beeley also put out an article for Mint Press News, which focused on her experience in Syria and her apparent findings that, yeah, the white helmets were not what they were being promoted at in the mainstream. Now, if you don't know the white helmets, there was a Netflix documentary about them. It won Oscar awards. To me, whenever something like that is really being embraced by the media, it's a sign that they want the public to pay attention to it. And yeah, it might be likely propaganda if they're pushing it so hard like that. But check out those reports because, again, the White House, all these things, they're relying heavily on the white helmets. Now, this Newsweek article goes on. This is another important aspect of this. The UN Joint Investigator, Carla Del Ponte, she put out her own report, and basically she withdrew in protest because the U.S. would not investigate her findings, which showed that the chemical weapons were used by the rebels. Again, so another person finding that the rebels were likely involved with these attacks. And she put out a report, she found that, but it was dismissed and has not been fully investigated. So far we have people from the head of the U.S. military, we have ex-science advisors with the Department of Defense and various other individuals debunking these claims. We have a UN joint investigator saying that, hey, the rebels were probably the ones using these chemical attacks. And as I'm going to show you, though, there are conflicting reports, and I don't claim to know which way, one way or the other. Assad, again, is no hero. The Syrian government may have at some point used gas on their own people. But we do know for sure that the other side, the U.S.-funded Western interest side, which I live in the United States, this is my concern, that they have definitely used weapons. And now you can look at this report here from the United Nations news website. Both ISIL and the Syrian government are responsible for use of chemical weapons, the UN Security Council says. So in this case, this is November 7, 2017, the UN Joint Investigative Mechanism for the Organization on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons admits that they have found both sides have used weapons. So both these sides have used chemical weapons. So we have no evidence of chemical weapons attacks in the most recent case. As of last year, they were saying that they found evidence that in the past instances that there has been weapons used on both sides, chemical weapons used on both sides. And again, as this information is still just developing because we didn't really have strong evidence, but they decided to strike anyways. Mattis first said, before we attack, we're going to confirm if there were chemical weapons attacks, right? That's what he said. He said they're discussing options with the president to respond to the chemical weapons attack. This was before Trump actually launched his missiles. And he said that he believes that there was chemical weapons, but they're still looking at conclusive evidence before they strike. Well, too bad, because Trump went ahead and struck with missiles anyways. And, the whole thing happened. The next day, you can see this right here. This is a transcript from defense.gov. This is a government website of a press conference where Secretary Mattis is being questioned by a reporter about his statements. So a question to Secretary Mattis. Up until yesterday, and I'm going to quote you here, you said, "I cannot tell you that we have evidence. So when did you become confident that a chemical attack happened?" So he's basically saying, just the other day you said you had no evidence. Now you're saying you do have evidence. Mattis says, yes, yesterday. And the reporter says, since yesterday, after you said that? He says, yes. So right there he's saying, well, we didn't have the evidence, now we did. He didn't offer any conclusive. He didn't say how, he's just saying, we didn't have it, now we do have it. So again, make of it what you will. We've got some people saying never happened, some people saying both sides are using chemical weapons. The U.S. government themselves are contradicting themselves. And this moves me up to the next point I want to talk about. We talked about now the possibility that there's no evidence at all, or that the evidence contradicts itself, and that both sides have used weapons, chemical weapons. Now we have independent reports of people actually on the ground, not just doing what I'm doing, talking from another country, but actually visiting on the ground. One of these is Robert Fisk, who wrote a report for The Independent, as well as this Pearson guy who wrote for One American News Network. Now, as I started to look into this, I realized that actually it wasn't just these two individuals that were allowed into Syria this past week. There was a whole collection of journalists from the agency, from AP from France, then there was CBS News anchors and others that we're going to look at here. But these individuals were actually allowed on the ground in there, and apparently were able to interview people, some who said that there was no chemical attack. So Robert Fisk, he's writing for The Independent, right? And right now he's getting attacked in the media because people are saying that he's a Russian agent or what have you. But he's not so easy to dismiss as maybe some of us are who can be labeled that. He's won the British Press Award Journalist of the Year prize, and he's a 7-time winner of the British Press Foreign Correspondent of the Year award. He also has been called probably the most famous foreign correspondent in Britain by the New York Times, and The Guardian said that he's probably one of the most famous journalists in the world, right? So he's very well known. I mean, awards don't necessarily mean anything at the end of the day, but it shows you that he's got experience. He's not just some bum off the street trying to claim that he went and found evidence. He's a hardened foreign correspondent who also speaks Arabic, so he doesn't need translators. And he claims that he interviewed all kinds of people, specifically doctors, and he named the doctor, Dr. Asim Rahabini, and I'm sure I'm saying the name wrong, but the difference in this is that he's actually naming a doctor, whereas the U.S. government, the Western governments, they just say, we have anonymous sources, we have random doctors, we have the white helmets. There's no, this is 2018 in the digital age. If you've got evidence, put it on camera, interview somebody on film and let us hear these stories. And we're only getting bits and pieces of information. I know there are people out there who've got pictures and images of family members, foaming at the mouth. They said this is a result of chemical weapons attacks. But if they want the American people or the people of the world to support war, which I don't think I ever would regardless, then they're going to have to provide evidence, or they should. You would think so. So Robert Fisk comes and interviews this doctor, and the doctor basically says, yes, the gas videotape was genuine. He says that videotape that some of you have seen of these people cleaning off these kids and washing them off as they're yelling that there was a gas attack. Well, this same 58-year-old senior Syrian doctor then adds something profoundly uncomfortable. This is from Robert Fisk's article. He says, the patients were overcome not by gas, but by oxygen starvation in the rubbish-filled tunnels and basements in which they lived on a night of wind and heavy shelling. So again, you can take this for what you will. Read the article. I'm linking all this here. I want you to read the full thing because he really goes into detail here. This one part here where the doctor is actually describing it. The doctor says this: I was with my family in the basement of my home 300 meters from here on the night, but all the doctors know what happened. There was a lot of shelling by government forces, and aircraft were always over Douma at night. But on this night, there was wind, and huge dust clouds began to come into the basements and cellars where people lived. People began to arrive here suffering from hypoxia, which is oxygen loss. Then, he says, someone at the door, a white helmet, again, the white helmets show up, shouted gas, and a panic began. People started throwing water over each other. The video was filmed here. It is genuine, but what you are seeing is people suffering from hypoxia, not gas poisoning. That's Robert Fisk, independent journalist, writing for the Independent, seasoned journalist. Now let's move on to the next example. This is another one that has been attacked by people because, well, One American News Network, I probably wouldn't watch them much. I'm sure they've got some truthful reporting. They seem to lean far-right, conservative. Apparently the man who owns the company is a Trump supporter, so that might affect the reporting in some ways. But at the end of the day, this journalist here, Pearson Sharp of One American News, he went to Syria and actually interviewed people and talked to individuals himself. He didn't rely on the corporate media or to sit on the sidelines. And again, the same thing that Robert Fisk found. He started interviewing people. According to Sharp, he interviewed 30 to 40 residents of Douma and found people who said that they did not witness the attacks. Now, I did find some interesting articles now on The Intercept. The Intercept is typically a pretty anti-establishment website, but recently they've been attacking people who question whether Bashar al-Assad did this, and basically calling people Assad lovers and Assad fans or whatever. But they did point out some important things, that they show that before the journalists actually arrived, before the One American News Network and the CBS journalists and the AFP and Robert Fisk showed up, Russia's defense ministry reported that soldiers from the Center for Reconciliation, which has ties to Russian military intelligence, carried out interrogation of witnesses, and that they arrived at least 4 days before the foreign journalists were allowed to be on the scene. So it's completely possible that in that time, in those 4 days, the witnesses, these apparent witnesses, were interrogated, were questioned, were threatened by the Russian police, the Center for Reconciliation, or the Syrian military. Now also, if you look at this video here, this is from the same Intercept article that's criticizing One American News. They show this, that Pearson Sharp is interviewing people, but apparently the spot that he chose to interview people is actually a couple blocks away from where the actual attack happened. And they show here in this picture, right here you can see this guy in the blue shirt. He's one of the journalists from the Swedish TV. He's being led around by this man in the red shirt, so he's on the way to the actual scene. Apparently Pearson Sharp was interviewing people, but not people who were literally on the site. He's like down the block. So it's completely possible he interviewed people who didn't witness anything because he wasn't in the right location. That's one thing to consider. And as far as the Russian military being on site, this is confirmed in this press release from the Russian government themselves. It says the Russian military was deployed in the city to control observation of the ceasefire to ensure security, and that Russia is ready to secure representatives of the OPCW, the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, in the city of Duma. So the Russian military were indeed in the area, and they were there actively, apparently to do security work. But it's completely possible that that compromised the situation. Now you can also see in this video here, I'm just going to link this below, from the CBS reporter where he's on site, and he actually does go to the apparent site of the chemical attack, and he shows grenades, he shows some canisters of things taking place. And in the video though, he says several times that this area was controlled by rebels, that the area that they are visiting, it shows that the Syrian government has kind of taken it back down. The people, you see the flag waving right here, the people are waving the Syrian flag, and they're celebrating that the government has taken it back from the rebels. And they find in the formerly rebel-held territory, they find weapons. So there's clear evidence there that if that indeed was where the rebels were, they were probably using weapons as well. So we have foreign correspondents coming into and refuting and conflicting with some of the mainstream corporate media. It's up for you guys to decide. Now the last point I want to talk about gets into some of the history that I mentioned. This article here is worth your time. It's called Trump's Syria Withdrawal Was Textbook U.S. Deception. And now if you've been able to make it this far and you're able to suspend your disbelief in the idea that anybody who questions the Syrian war or questions this and thinks that maybe we're being lied to again is somehow a stooge for Russia or stooge for Syria, if you can get past that and look at this document, this is from the Brookings Institution, and if you're unaware of what the Brookings Institution is, do some research on them. They are a think tank, a policy group like many others out there, similar to the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, all these various think tanks and organizations and nonprofit and NGOs that interconnect to create essentially a parallel government. These are, some would say, part of the deep state, part of the, outside of the government state, because they're not elected, and officially they don't have power, but these are influential people who are connected to people in power who write policy papers, and sometimes these policy papers become reality, and so it's important to study them. In 2009, they wrote this paper called Which Path to Persia? Options for a New American Strategy Towards Iran. And everything from supporting terrorists in a proxy war to faking provocations to full-scale war was planned in this document. Now, I recently wrote an article about John Bolton. John Bolton has been put into the Trump cabinet recently, and if you remember John Bolton, he was the guy who was in the Bush administration in the early 2000s, George W. Bush, talking about weapons of mass destruction and calling for war. This guy is bloodthirsty. He wanted war in Iraq, he got it, and he's been pushing for war in Iran for the last 2 decades. And now that Trump has added him to his team, the article I wrote was basically saying regime change is going to come to Iran now that this guy is in power. I still believe that's accurate, but it's obvious they want to get Syria and Bashar al-Assad out of the way and under control before they do that. So in this article here, they talk about how in order to garner public support for going into Iran, there would need to be widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer. And he says, under these circumstances, the United States could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger, and at least some people in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it on themselves. This is what the paper says. It would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. So they're sitting here talking about using some sort of, I mean, there's no other way to call it other than a false flag, using some sort of provocation to get public support, to generate support for the war. So this was written back in 2009. So this plan, this idea has been in the minds of people for some time, right? But we can go back even further than that and check this out. This is a 1986 CIA document which is analyzing the possibility of regime change in Syria. And you might say, yeah, that's what the CIA does. They overthrow governments around the world. That's no big surprise. They probably have a document somewhere on how to overthrow every single country that we can think of because they've thought about it, if not already done it by this point. And that is true. However, this illustrates that the United States has been trying to get into the region, Syria, Iran, the Middle East, for decades and decades. And we also have the video from General Wesley Clark.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
This shows you that they've had this plan. They've had it since 9/11, since after 9/11, and apparently the CIA thought about this during the Reagan administration, according to a document titled "Bringing Real Muscle to Bear in Syria," which is written by CIA officer Graham Fuller. In this document, he wrote, "Syria at present has a hammerlock on U.S. interests both in Lebanon and in the Gulf through closure of Iraq's pipeline, thereby threatening Iraqi internationalization. The U.S. should consider sharply escalating pressures against Assad, through covertly orchestrating simultaneous military threats against Syria from 3 border states hostile to Syria: Iraq, Israel, and Turkey." So literally, they're talking about creating conflicts along Syria's borders to provoke, at this time was Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez Assad, back in 1983. Of course, because he was seen as a block to U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. And I definitely want you guys to read more of this article to continue to look at this. There's another CIA document from 1986 called "Syria: Scenarios of Dramatic Political Change," and it just outlines the different methods that they could use to try to overthrow Assad. So what I'm asking you here is to look at, despite the crying children, despite the proclamations from corporate media and from politicians, to look at this evidence that I've already presented and to look at the history that shows that these individuals have had this plan for some time now. And what we're seeing unfold now here is, I think, a long-term plan. I ask that you would check this piece out here as I wrap this up. The Middle East, military intervention over there has never been about humanitarian anything. Humanitarian bombing, that's this idea they started in Libya. It's never been about that. It's never been about saving the people. It's about conquest. It's about conflict. Read this article from the Middle East Monitor. It's very important. And at the same time as all these things are going on, that the U.S. is bombing without clear evidence, that the chemical weapons investigators haven't had a chance to really study the situation. Saudi Arabia has already deployed troops to Syria in support of the U.S., so Saudi Arabia is sending troops along the border. And thousands of troops from the U.S. are now amassing on Syria's border in Jordan. And just as we showed you a moment ago, that document talked about putting soldiers and creating conflicts along Syria's border. So the U.S. is already committed to this conflict. And first it was like, no, we're not going to try to get rid of Assad. We just want to get the bad guys out. Now the bad guys are gone, or people stop believing in the boogeyman, and now they're saying they want to get rid of Assad. So I say all these things. I started out by saying that I gave it a couple weeks to really think about how I want to do this report, but it's become more and more clear to me that there are so many different sides to this that I'm not sure what's at the bottom of it. But I will say that as of today, as of Saturday the 21st, the OPCW inspectors did actually make it to Duma, and they're apparently going to begin their investigation. So 2 reports from Middle East Eye and then from Al Jazeera confirmed that the chemical weapons inspectors did reach Duma, and they will be they're now there 2 weeks though. The attack apparently happened on April 7th. Now we're here April 21st. It's been 2 weeks. As we said, the U.S. bombed the area where the attack supposedly happened. The Russian police were patrolling the area and potentially were able to get to witnesses. It's difficult to assess what exactly is happening. So yeah, that's kind of where it's at. And of course, the other thing is the U.S. has already accused Russia of possibly tampering with the gas attack evidence in Syria. So the U.S. is already prepared for if the investigators come and say, hey, yes, something was used, or no, it wasn't used. Basically, if it doesn't go the way that the U.S. wants, they can say, well, we told you the Russians interfered with it. And they're prepared for that. They're really prepared for going down that road. And I think that we as free people need to be prepared to do the research. This takes a lot of time. Like, this was supposed to be a short video. This is probably now at 25 or 30 minutes long. And even with trying to cut it down, there's a lot of important information. I'm looking at upwards of 25 articles here, researching, watching videos, listening to podcasts, and trying to get the full take of what's going on. And all I know is that war is always bad in my eyes, because war is the rich man's game. They're taking poor people from one country and having them fight poor people from another country in the name of some rich man's effort to get resources and oil and whatever you want to call it. And at the end of the day, it's us, the people, who are going to suffer, the free people at the bottom of this thing, not the people at the top of the pyramid. So I think we should think about this clearly before we just call for bombing of people and before we allow our emotions to be played. I hope that this has been informative, educational in some way, and if you have links or information for me, please send them to me at derrick@theconsciousresistance.com. And yeah, I hope you remain clear-headed out there. Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace.